The Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was less a home and more a monument to cold, hard success. Its stark, minimalist architecture featured vast walls of glass that looked out onto a garden so perfectly manicured it seemed lifeless, as if nature itself had been subdued into silent submission. Inside, the silence was even more profound, broken only by the faint, distant hum of the climate control system. Expensive art hung on the walls, not for beauty, but as declarations of power, each piece a calculated investment. The staff moved through the cavernous halls like shadows, their presence felt but rarely seen, their quiet efficiency a stark contrast to the immense sterile wealth they maintained. There was no warmth here, no laughter echoing in the corridors, only the heavy, unspoken pressure of maintaining a flawless facade for a world that was always watching. Ethan Sterling stood before one of those massive windows, his reflection a faint ghost against the sterile perfection of the garden beyond. At 22, he wore his designer labels like a uniform he hadn't chosen, the fabric expensive, but the fit constricting his very soul. His posture was restrained, his shoulders carrying a weight far heavier than his years, and his gaze was perpetually melancholic, observing the world around him with a weary intelligence that saw through the hypocrisy his family embraced. He was the heir to a corporate empire, a prince in a gilded cage, yet he felt a profound and gnawing emptiness. Surrounded by unimaginable luxury, he was starved for a single ounce of genuine affection, tormented by a conscience his father had long tried to extinguish. His suspicion had been a low, persistent hum for weeks, ever since Elena, the housekeeper with the kind eyes, had simply vanished. He found himself in her old room in the staff wing, a space now as sterile and impersonal as the rest of the house. He ran his hand along the simple wooden furniture, searching for a trace of the woman who had shown him more quiet kindness than his own mother. It was then that his fingers brushed against a small, crumpled piece of paper wedged behind the nightstand. He pulled it out and smoothed it open. It was an ultrasound photo, grainy and small, but the tiny, curled shape within it was unmistakable. It was the image of a new life, a fragile promise discovered in the heart of a home that felt more like a mausoleum. He found his father, Warren Sterling, in his cavernous study, a room that smelled of old leather and ambition. Ethan didn't speak. He simply placed the small, crumpled photo on the polished mahogany desk. Warren glanced at it, his expression not shifting from its usual mask of detached authority. There was no flicker of surprise, no hint of shame, only a cold, rising tide of irritation. "I dealt with that," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I sent her away to solve her problem far from here." The words were delivered with the same casual disdain he might use to discuss a failed business deal. For Ethan, that simple, cruel sentence was a seismic event, shattering the last fragile remnants of his toxic loyalty. The abstract injustice of his world suddenly had a face, a name, and a tiny, defenseless heartbeat. It's in moments like this, when a person's entire world shifts on its axis, that you realize the power of a single story. If you believe in that power too, subscribing helps us ensure these vital accounts continue to be shared. The heavy weight of his father's words settled in Ethan's chest, a cold, dense mass of betrayal. He left the study without another word, the tiny ultrasound photo clutched in his hand like a sacred relic. The grand, silent halls of the estate felt suffocating, each piece of art a monument to the moral vacuum he was born into. His first move was not one of anger, but of quiet, methodical purpose. He retreated to his own suite, a space as minimalist and impersonal as the rest, and opened his laptop. With a few keystrokes, he accessed a private account his father knew nothing about and hired a discreet investigator. The instructions were simple and urgent. Find Elena. He provided her full name, her last known address at the estate, and a recent photograph. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew he had the resources to cut through the anonymity his father had imposed on her. The investigator was good, frighteningly so. Within 24 hours, an encrypted email arrived with an address. It wasn't in a quiet suburban town or a neighboring state. It was on the industrial outskirts of the city, in a part of town the Sterling family pretended didn't exist. The location was a weekly rate motel called the Starlight Inn, and the name that was a cruel joke under the perpetual smog from the nearby factories. Ethan stared at the satellite image, a bleak landscape of cracked asphalt and drab, low-slung buildings. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and stone facades of Greenwich. The sterile perfection he had grown up in had never felt more like a prison, and the grim reality of that address was the key to his escape, a destination he had to reach to begin to understand the true cost of his family's wealth. Driving his sleek, silent electric car through that part of the city felt like a transgression. The world outside his tinted windows shifted from polished affluence to gritty survival. He parked a block away from the Starlight Inn and walked. The unfamiliar sounds of the city pressing in on him, the rumble of distant trucks, the wail of a far-off siren, the harsh laughter from a corner bar. The motel's neon sign buzzed and flickered, one of the letters dark. The air smelled of damp concrete and fried food. He felt the stares of people on the street, his well-tailored clothes marking him as an outsider. A tourist in their world of hardship. He clutched the slip of paper with Elena's room number, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs, a mix of fear and an unshakable sense of duty. He found room 2B at the end of a dimly lit outdoor corridor. The green paint on the door was peeling, revealing layers of older colors beneath. He took a deep breath and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the relative quiet. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, held by a tarnished security chain. A sliver of a face appeared in the gap. It was Elena, but a version of her he barely recognized. Her cheeks were hollowed, dark circles etched beneath her expressive eyes, which were now wide with suspicion and fear. She wore a faded, oversized sweater that did little to hide the gentle swell of her pregnancy. The woman, who had always moved with quiet efficiency and a gentle smile, now looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee at the slightest provocation. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice raspy, laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a gesture of pure protection. He could see the squalor of the room behind her, a lumpy bed, a single chair, a cardboard box of belongings on the floor. It was a scene of such profound desolation that it physically hurt him to look at it. "My father didn't send you, did he?" she asked, her voice hardening slightly. Ethan shook his head, struggling to find the words. The apology he had rehearsed in the car felt hollow and inadequate in the face of this reality. He was a representative of the world that had done this to her, and he knew it. The chasm between them felt a mile wide, built of money, power, and a brutal lack of compassion. He finally found his voice, keeping it low and steady. "No, I came on my own. Elena, can I please come in? I just want to talk." "Jay." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the deep-seated distrust warring with a flicker of the memory of the kind boy she once knew. After a long, tense silence, she unlatched the chain and opened the door. The room was even smaller and more depressing from the inside. He stepped in, feeling like a giant in the cramped space. He didn't sit. He simply stood before her and held out the crumpled ultrasound photo. "I found this," he said softly, and I confronted him. I know what he did. Then came the words that mattered. "I am so sorry, Elena, for everything, for what he did, for what my family stands for. I am so deeply sorry." It's moments like these where one person's quiet courage meets another's awakening conscience that change the world. If you believe these stories of quiet rebellion deserve a voice, subscribing allows us to keep bringing them to light. Elena stared at him, her defensive posture slowly softening as she registered the genuine remorse in his eyes. She didn't cry, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away. She gestured toward the room's only chair, a gesture of hospitality that was heartbreaking in its dignity amidst her destitution. As he sat, she began to speak, not with anger, but with a weary sort of calm. She told him how she'd been summoned to his father's study, how he had offered her a sum of money she couldn't refuse to take care of the problem and disappear. When she refused, he had her escorted off the property that very hour, with a check for severance and a cold warning to never contact the family again. She spoke of the fear, the isolation, and the constant gnawing anxiety for her unborn child. As he listened, Ethan felt the last vestiges of his old life crumbling away. This wasn't an abstract injustice anymore. It had a name, a face, and a story of quiet suffering. He saw the strength in her, the fierce maternal instinct that had allowed her to survive this far. He wasn't just looking at a former housekeeper. He was looking at the mother of his niece, a woman his father had tried to erase. He saw the simple dignity she clung to, a treasure more valuable than anything in his father's vaults. In that small, bleak room, a new kind of loyalty began to form, not to a name or a fortune, but to the two people in front of him whose lives had been so carelessly discarded. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not walk away and let them face this alone. The drive back to Greenwich was a journey through a fog of revelation. The opulent mansions and pristine landscapes that had once represented home now seemed grotesque, their beauty a lie built on the silent suffering of people like Elena. He felt a profound sense of alienation, as if he were seeing his own world for the first time through a lens of truth. The fear of his father was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now secondary to a more powerful emotion, a fierce, protective resolve. He was no longer just Warren Sterling's son. He was Elena's ally, and he was Lily's uncle. He was choosing a new family, not of blood, but of principle. These are the choices that define us, and sharing them is why we do this. Your subscription is what makes it possible for more journeys of integrity to be told. His first action was decisive. He used his personal funds to rent a clean, furnished two-bedroom apartment in a safe, quiet neighborhood far from both the motel and Greenwich. He arranged for groceries to be delivered and scheduled an appointment with one of the best obstetricians in the state. When he brought Eleanor to her new home, her quiet gratitude was more rewarding than any praise he had ever received. But his actions did not go unnoticed. The whispers started almost immediately. At the country club, old family friends would nod curtly and turn away. His mother called him, her voice a mixture of tears and accusations, pleading with him to stop this embarrassing crusade and think of the family's reputation. He was no longer just an heir. He was becoming a pariah in his own world. Then came the call from his father. Warren's voice was devoid of its usual booming authority, replaced by something far more chilling, a low, controlled tone of pure menace. He didn't yell. He calmly informed Ethan that his access to his trust fund had been suspended. He spoke of Elena not as a person, but as a problem Ethan had foolishly complicated. "You think you can play the hero, boy?" Warren's voice was like ice. "You have no idea what you're up against. I will bury you both in legal fees. I will make it so that girl can't get a job washing dishes in this state. You will walk away from this, or I will dismantle your entire future, piece by piece." The threat was not idle. It was a promise from a man who had built an empire on crushing his opposition. The pressure mounted, a relentless siege on all fronts. The final blow came not from his father, but from the doctor. After a series of tests, the obstetrician sat them down, his expression grave. He explained that due to the extreme stress and poor nutrition Elena had endured during the first months of her pregnancy, it was now officially classified as high risk. There were concerns about the baby's growth and Elena's own health. She would require constant monitoring and complete bed rest for the foreseeable future. The news landed like a physical weight. It was no longer a battle of wills or finances. It was now a race against time, a fight for the very survival of the tiny, fragile life that had started it all. The stakes had been raised to their absolute peak. The Sterling Corporation's annual gala was the pinnacle of Greenwich society, a symphony of champagne flutes, feigned laughter, and calculated networking. The grand ballroom was awash in soft gold light, illuminating the powerful and the privileged as they celebrated another year of ruthless success. Warren Sterling stood at the podium, a conquering king addressing his court. His speech, a self-aggrandizing tribute to legacy and family values. It was at the peak of his oration, as applause thundered through the hall, that a side door opened, cutting a silent path through the noise. Ethan entered, not in the expected tuxedo, but in a simple, dark suit that seemed to absorb the room's opulent light. Beside him, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her pregnancy, was Eleanor. She wore a simple dress, but her posture was regal, her gaze steady, radiating a quiet dignity that instantly rendered the surrounding luxury cheap and hollow. The applause faltered, and a wave of silence washed over the room. Warren's smile froze, a grotesque mask of disbelief that quickly melted into pure, unadulterated fury. He gestured discreetly but urgently for security, his eyes 2 chips of ice fixed on his son. But this was not the hesitant, melancholic boy he had raised. This was a man. Ethan met his father's gaze without flinching, and walked with a calm, deliberate pace toward the stage, Elena at his side. He didn't rush or shout. He simply took the secondary microphone from the lectern, his voice clear and steady as it cut through the shocked silence of the room. "I apologize for the interruption," he began, his tone respectful but firm, addressing the stunned audience. "My father was just speaking about legacy, about the values we pass down. I felt it was important to add a more complete picture of the Sterling family's most recent contribution to that legacy." He then turned his head slightly, nodding toward the enormous projection screen behind his father. The gleaming corporate logo on the screen dissolved, replaced by the stark, blue and white interface of a text message conversation. The words were Warren Sterling's, enlarged for all to see, cold and brutal directives, instructing an associate to intimidate Elena into silence. Before the audience could fully process the text, the screen went black and an audio file began to play. The sound of Warren's voice, a low and menacing rumble, filled the cavernous hall. The recorded phone call where he threatened to dismantle Ethan's entire future, to crush Elena, to make them both disappear. The guests sat frozen, their faces a mixture of horror and fascination. The final image to appear was the most damning of all, a clinical black and white document. It was the result of a DNA test, its conclusion stated in simple scientific terms that left no room for doubt, confirming Warren Sterling's genetic link to the unborn child Elena was carrying. Ethan lowered the microphone, the silence in the room now so profound it felt like a physical pressure. He turned his full attention to his father, who stood pale and trembling, his carefully constructed world shattered in front of his peers. Ethan's voice, when he spoke again, was devoid of vengeance. It was filled with a deep, resonant sorrow, the sound of a son mourning the man his father could never be. "Your entire life, your greatest asset has been your power to destroy others. You see people as obstacles to be removed or assets to be exploited, Ethan said, his words a quiet indictment, not a loud accusation. But I've learned something you never understood. True strength isn't in what you can break, but in what you can build. So my inheritance, the one I choose, will not be your company or your money. My legacy will be to build a safe and beautiful life for the people you tried to erase. Warren Sterling did not reply. There were no words left. The public humiliation was absolute, a wound from which his pride would never recover. A strangled, guttural sound tore from his throat, a roar of pure, impotent rage. His face turned a deep, alarming crimson, and he staggered backward, clutching his chest before collapsing onto the stage. A wave of chaos erupted as guests surged forward, shouting for a doctor. But Ethan didn't watch his father fall. His part in that life was over. He turned his back on the wreckage, his gaze finding Elena's. He gently took her arm, shielding her from the pandemonium, and together they walked away from the stage, out of the ballroom, and into the quiet of the night. They were not a victim and a savior, but two equals, a new family forged in the fire of injustice, stepping out of the shadow of a broken legacy and into the light of their own making. The legal battle that followed was brief and brutal, but not in the way Warren Sterling had intended. With the mountain of evidence Ethan had collected, the fight was not for victory, but for terms. Elena, guided by Ethan and a compassionate lawyer he had hired, did not seek a king's ransom or a slice of the Sterling Empire. She sought something far more profound, recognition and security for her daughter. The settlement was substantial, enough to guarantee Lily a future free from the poverty that had threatened her very existence. But for Elena and Ethan, the money was never the prize. It was a tool, a means to an end they had already envisioned. They accepted the funds not as a reward, but as a responsibility, the seed capital for a legacy entirely different from the one built on cold, hard cash and broken lives. They didn't buy a mansion in Greenwich or a penthouse overlooking the city. Instead, they purchased a large, slightly worn, but beautiful old house in a quiet, working-class neighborhood, a place with a sprawling backyard and rooms filled with sunlight. This became the headquarters for the Lily Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing shelter, legal aid, and a fresh start for single mothers facing homelessness. Ethan, having formally renounced his name and inheritance, poured all his energy into managing the foundation. He traded his designer suits for jeans and learned about grant writing and social work. Elena, having found her voice, became its heart, her own experience a beacon of hope for the women who walked through their doors. The sterile silence of the Sterling estate was replaced by the sound of children's laughter and the quiet hum of women rebuilding their lives. Years passed, transforming the landscape of their lives. Lily, at 5 years old, was a bright, joyful child with her mother's resilient eyes and Ethan's quiet, observant nature. She knew nothing of the corporate gala or the squalid motel room. Her world was the foundation's community garden, the stories read to her at night, and the unconditional love of her mother and her uncle. The bond between Elena and Ethan had deepened into a unique and powerful partnership, a family forged not by blood or romance, but by a shared commitment to a cause greater than themselves. They had found their purpose not in taking down an empire, but in building a sanctuary, one life at a time. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest legacies are not the ones we inherit, but the ones we choose to create. And your support helps us continue to share these profound stories of courage and conviction. One sunny afternoon, as Lily played on a swing set in the foundation's backyard, a young woman stood hesitantly at the gate, her fear a palpable aura around her, her belly swollen with a new life. Elena saw her first and walked over, her smile warm and without a trace of pity. Ethan joined them a moment later, putting a comforting hand on Elena's shoulder. He looked from the scared newcomer to the confident woman beside him, and then to the happy child on the swing. This was the cycle they had created, not one of wealth and power, but one of compassion and hope. The sterling name might still be etched onto skyscrapers, but the true inheritance, the one that mattered, was right here in this garden. A quiet, powerful testament to the fact that the most beautiful things are not owned, but built.